Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, and that means that I'm always learning and studying about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, The History of Middle-earth, or any of his other works. I'm generally speaking the guy that you can come to and ask any sort of question about it, and if I don't have a quick and snappy answer for you, I will certainly research it for you and get back to you. And so, of course, we have this whole series where I answer your questions. Now, if you want to have a question answered, you can just do so. You can ask your question right there in the comments section, and I'll try to get to it. I'm pretty good about answering questions in the comments. If you want to be featured in a video, however, the place that you want to find me is on Quora. So there is a link to my Quora in the description. It's very easy to set up an account there. You could use your Facebook account. You could use your Google account. A few other things to just sort of get a quick one-click register. Ask your question on there. If you ask any sort of question related to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, there is going to be a part after you write out your question where it tells you to tag people that have experience answering these sort of questions. And there's going to be a list of people, and my name will be at or near the top of that list. Now, that being said, you can also, like I said, just use the link right in the description that goes directly to my Quora, as well as my Quora space, The Grey Havens. So we have, I believe, 17 questions to get through today. I actually did not write as much as I probably should have in the past week, because I had a bit of an injury with my back that, well, it's a very old injury, but it aggravates itself from time to time, and there were 3 days that I basically spent in bed. I got out of bed very, very rarely, and I certainly did not spend a lot of time writing, but I did play catch-up yesterday, and I was surprised to find that when choosing questions for this video, there was more than enough to choose from. I really thought that I hadn't gotten much done, but it turns out that there were some really good questions in here. Quick channel update. As of me recording this right now, we currently have 1,494 subscribers. So like 1,500 is just like coming smack dab. And I'm recording this on the 11th. Well, it's technically the 11th because it's after midnight is what it is. It's the 10th really, but it's just after midnight when I'm recording this. So basically I'm recording this on late night, Tuesday the 10th into early morning, Wednesday the 11th. The video is going to go up tomorrow, or I should say later today, on the 11th for members only. And I just got an email from YouTube that tells me that members-only videos will actually be shown to everybody's subscriber feed so that more people will be aware of how early these videos go up. So hopefully some of you guys will see, like, wow, he really does put up the videos a full week early, because while this video will go live for members on the 11th, it will be available for everybody on the 18th. So, of course, we're trying to push the subscriber numbers up. We're really just very, very close to 1,500, and by the time this video goes live to members, we might have already hit that number. That's really great. But we're trying to build and build and build and build, of course, and just grow our brand here on YouTube. So if you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. You don't have to right now. Watch the video a little longer and see if it's to your taste. If you've reached the end of the video and then you haven't subscribed already, well, at that point you'll have watched probably around 50 or so minutes of me rambling about the Lord of the Rings and such, so you probably want to subscribe at that point if you've watched that much of it. And I'll remind you, trust me, don't worry. You don't have to remember. I'll remember for you. We are going to do a reading, but a quick update on some other stuff. So normally the first Thursday of every month on Twitch, and there should be a link to that, my Twitch, in the description of this video and every video that I do as well, we do a live stream of the Council of Tolkien, and then later on in the month it goes up on YouTube. And the Council of Tolkien is a panel-style podcast with myself and Matt Richardson and Sid Kemp, and we did not do it on the 5th like we normally would. And basically, I don't want to get into too many details, but Sid was unavailable. And we were going to do it again on the 12th, which is this Thursday, but that's also not going to happen. But I did get an email from Sid just today that he was unavailable, but he is becoming available again. Like I said, I don't want to get into too much details because it is his, personal life there. He'll probably talk about it on the show anyway, but we are going to do that on the 19th. On the 12th instead, yeah, and like I said, you might be watching this on the 12th if you're a member. If not, this has already happened. But I also do readings from Tolkien's work once a month on Twitch as well, and we finished up The Hobbit, so we're going to be starting The Lord of the Rings, starting of course with The Fellowship of the Ring, and so I'll be doing that this Thursday. Or like I said, if you're not a member, it's already happened, because these are done well in advance so that channel members can see them at least 7 days early. So I'm going to read from Unfinished Tales, and Unfinished Tales is sort of one of my favorite things to bring up when I say something, whether it's on Quora or just in general conversation with people and speaking about, I would say, the Lord of the Rings or characters related to the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit in some instances as well, especially, yes, the Hobbit, because there's a whole section specifically about the quest for Erebor. But anyway, there are a few things that I'll say, and people will say, well, where are you getting that from? Where does that come from? And it's usually the answer is Unfinished Tales. Sometimes the answer is the Silmarillion, because there is a whole section of the Silmarillion, the last chapter, called Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. However, there are a lot of times where it's actually Unfinished Tales. And I get some people who get, I want to say, extremely arrogant, I would say, would be the word, where they say, well, and I had an argument with somebody on Quora not too long ago where this person was saying, I've been studying the Lord of the Rings for 50 years, and I've never read that. And I was thinking, well, there's more than just the Lord of the Rings, there's other books out there that Tolkien wrote, some of which were published posthumously and edited by other people, most notably his son Christopher Tolkien, but also others as well. But there's a lot more to it than just the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. And I don't even know if he knew about the Silmarillion. I would assume he does. Unfinished Tales it tends to be something that less people know about, it seems. And so I'll make references to things like Isildur wishing to bring the ring to Elrond. And people say, well, he wasn't doing that. This is what the argument was about. It says, I've never seen that. You're making it up. And of course, I took a screenshot of the page and showed it to him because, why argue when you can just show somebody the source directly? I don't like to engage with extremely rude people, but, when you build up a bit of a reputation, you do have to uphold it. Another thing that gets called into question that I bring up is that Saruman had, and this comes up in one of the questions later that we're going to be reading today, Saruman had a special secret room in Orthanc where he kept the Elendil mirror, which was the sort of circlet that Isildur wore when he died, and Saruman had it, indicating that he had found Isildur's remains and kept his effects. And there was a special place in this room that was a spot of honor that was empty, that Aragorn, when he discovered this room, believed to be a spot that Saruman thought he would put the One Ring. And of course, if you know about the nature of the One Ring and how it works and how it affects people, and Saruman may be a fallen angel, but he's still kind of a person in that sense, and was definitely somebody who was coveting the One. That he was not really ever going to be able to leave it like that. Like Frodo kept it in a drawer for a really long time, but once he held it in his hand and really gazed upon it and came to appreciate it, it became precious to him, and he wasn't able to just leave it like that. People have asked questions on Quora like, why wouldn't Frodo just keep it in an envelope instead of, or something like that? And it's like, well, because you would be constantly plagued by paranoia, believing that it may slip out or something. And the ring is pretty crafty. So I'm going to read from Unfinished Tales, and almost all the answers to questions about where did you get that tends to be one particular story in here, which is a Third Age story, not the quest for Erebor, not the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. Here we go, the disaster of the Gladden Fields. And I make reference to the disaster of the Gladden Fields many, many times. And, usually people, whenever I reference this story, they say, well, that never happened. And I'll say, well, maybe you should get the book Unfinished Tales. It's quite a fascinating read. And you get a lot of stuff that's related to The Hobbit and to The Lord of the Rings, and also to the Silmarillion as well. You get the rest of the Children of Húrin, the parts that are not in the Silmarillion are here. Although I recommend getting that as its own book. But anyway, I'm actually going to... It's a short story. I probably could read the whole thing, but I'm not going to do that. Well, let's see. The Disaster of the Gladden Fields is extremely short. Most of the section is the appendix. The sources of the legend of Isildur's death. I think I want to cover two parts. I'm going to do two mini readings instead of one long one. One is going to cover the question I get all the time of where do you get the idea that in traveling to the north, Isildur was going to, or at least thought he was going to bring the ring to the elves. I'm going to read you that section right here. It seemed to Isildur that the enemy was withdrawing toward the forest. He looked back. The red rim of the sun gleamed out from the clouds as it went down behind the mountains. Night would soon be falling. He gave orders to resume the march at once, but to bend their course down toward the lower and flatter ground where the orcs would have less advantage. Maybe he believed that after their costly repulse they would give way, though their scouts might follow him during the night and watch his camp. That was the manner of orcs, who are most often dismayed when their prey could turn and bite. But he was mistaken. There was not only cunning in the attack, but fierce and relentless hatred. The orcs of the mountains were stiffened and commanded by grim servants of Barad-dûr, sent out long before to watch the passes. And though it was unknown to them, the ring, cut from his black hand 2 years before, was still laden with Sauron's evil will, and called to all his servants for their aid. The Dunedain had gone scarcely a mile when the orcs moved again. This time they did not charge, but used all their forces. They came down on a wide front, which bent into a crescent, and soon closed into an unbroken ring about the Dunedain. They were silent now, and kept at a distance out of the range of the dreaded steel bows of Númenor. Though the light was fading, and Isildur had all too few archers for his need, he halted. There was a pause, though the most keen-eyed among the Dunedain said that the orcs were moving inwards, stealthily, step by step. Elendil went to his father, who was standing dark and alone, as if lost in thought. "Atarinya," he said, "what of the power that would cow these foul creatures and command them to obey you? Is it then of no avail?" "Alas, it is not, Senya. I cannot use it. I dread the pain of touching it, and I have not yet found the strength to bend it to my will. It needs one greater than I now know myself to be. My pride has fallen. It should go to the keepers of the three." At that moment there came a sudden blast of horns, and the orcs closed in on all sides, flinging themselves against the Dunedain with reckless ferocity. Night had come, and hope faded. Men were falling, for some of the greater orcs leaped up, 2 at a time, and dead or alive with their weight bore down a Dunedain, so that the other strong claws could drag him out and slay him. The orcs might pay 5 to 1 in this exchange, but it was too cheap. Cirion was slain in this way, and Aratan mortally wounded in an attempt to rescue him. Elendil, not yet harmed, sought Isildur. He was rallying the men on the east side when the assault was heaviest, for the orcs still feel the Elendilmir that he bore on his brow and avoided him. Elendil touched him on his shoulder, and he turned fiercely, thinking an orc had crept behind. "My king," said Elendil, "Cirion is dead and Aratan is dying. Your last counselor must advise, nay, command you, as you commanded Ottar. Go, take your burden, and at all costs bring it to the keepers, even at the cost of abandoning your men and me." "King's son," said Isildur, "I know now that I must do, but I feared the pain. Nor could I go without your leave. Forgive me in my pride that has brought you to this doom." Elendil kissed him. Go now," he said. So we know what happens after that. He puts on the ring, and he swims away, and then the ring slips from him, and he comes up out of the water, and he gets shot by an arrow through the neck. And even if it was not a fatal blow, the arrows that the orcs were using were very poisoned and deadly in that sense. So even just a graze would be very, very perilous. So there you see that he was planning to bring the rings to the keepers of the three, referring to the elves, and they had already passed Lothlorien at this point, so it makes sense that they were going to Imladris, and that is in fact where the sole survivor goes, which is covered in the next section that I'm going to read a bit of. The source is the legend of Isildur's death. Ottar and his companions escaped. So not just one sole survivor, but the part about Saruman comes up at the end here, and I'll just read you that part briefly. But King Elisar, when he was crowned in Gondor, began the ordering of his realm, and one of his first tasks was the restoration of Orthanc, where he proposed to set up again the Palantir recovered from Saruman. Then all the secrets of the tower were searched. Many things of worth were found, jewels and heirlooms of Eorl, filched from Edoras by the agency of Wormtongue during King Theoden's decline, and other such things, more ancient and beautiful, from mounds and tombs far and wide. Saruman, in his degradation, had become not a dragon, but a jackdaw. At last, behind a hidden door that they could not have found or opened had not Elisar had the aid of Gimli the dwarf, a steel closet was revealed. Maybe it had been intended to receive the ring, but it was almost bare. In a casket on a high shelf, two things were laid. One was a small case of gold attached to a fine chain. It was empty and bore no letter or token, but beyond all doubt it had once borne the ring about Isildur's neck. Next to it lay a treasure without price, long mourned as lost forever, the Elendil mirror itself, the white star of elvish crystal upon a fillet of mithril, that had descended from Silmarion to Elendil, and had been taken by him as the token of royalty in the North Kingdom. Every king and the chieftains had followed him in Arnor had borne the Elendilmere down to even Elisar himself, but though it was a jewel of great beauty, made by the elven smiths in Imladris, for Valandil, Isildur's son, it had not the ancestry nor potency of the one that had been lost when Isildur fled the dark and came back no more. So, there's a little bit more, but that's the relevant part. So here we see it, but the secret room, the steel closet that Aragorn found with the help of Gimli. I guess, Gimli just has that ability, that natural knack to find secret passages. But there you have it. Two of the things, actually more than two of the things, but two of the things that I spoke about that are very related to questions that I get about where did you read that? Where does that come from? That Isildur was specifically going to bring the ring to the elves, and that Saruman had a secret room found by Aragorn in the early Fourth Age when he discovered the secret room that was meant to house the One Ring, and the Elendilmere was there. So anyway, we have a lot of questions, and some of them are related. Another name that came up there was Almariel. We'll be talking about that, about her later, and the Lords of Adunia in one of these answers. So let's get to your first question. So here's a question that came in from Jennifer Smith, who asks, I know it's a joke and a meme, but is there an actual canon reason why Legolas and Frodo never speak directly to each other? So the joke in the meme about Legolas never saying anything to Frodo, or Frodo never saying anything to Legolas, is really just related to the movies, the films, because he does actually speak with Frodo a few times in the book. Not very much, though. Legolas in the books, I would say that he really barely speaks at all. He doesn't have a whole lot of lines. Most of his dialogue that he does have is directed at Gimli or at Aragorn, or whatever character happens to be relevant, like Éomer or Galadriel. He does speak to Frodo, though, in a few scenes in and around Lothlorien. Even though the films made a great effort to make Legolas much more fleshed out as a character, even with him borrowing traits that actually in the books came from Aragorn, he had a lot of extra lines, but there wasn't anything really between him and Frodo. It was really Gimli and Aragorn, Gimli and Legolas, Legolas and Gimli, Legolas and Aragorn. There wasn't a lot of interaction between Frodo and Legolas in the book, and none of it made it into the films because I don't think that Peter Jackson felt that these were important lines to be said. But I will say that, in the book, they do speak to each other, however briefly. In Lothlorien, there is a scene where the elves are singing a lament for for Gandalf, and Frodo asks Legolas to translate a little bit of it, and he does translate just a little bit of it for him. Okay, next question. Here is a question that came in from Gabriel Theron Telenon, who asks, was it possible to make Middle-earth as beautiful as Valinor? I've heard from somewhere that Galadriel, with the One Ring, could have made Middle-earth so beautiful that it could rival the realm of the Valar. Well, this is something that really, if we think about it, comes from Sauron. He either thought this, or he lied about it at the very least, which is much more likely, knowing Sauron's personality. And it was an idea that he put into Celebrimbor's head. Let's take a look at what Sauron, in his guise as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, said to Celebrimbor to get into Eregion. Men he found the easiest to sway of all the peoples of the earth, but long he sought to persuade the elves to his service. For he knew that the firstborn had the greater power, and he went far and wide among them. And his hue was still that of one both fair and wise. Only to Lindon he did not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming. And though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon, bidding him beware. For Sauron took to himself the name of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. And they had at first much profit from his friendship. And he said to them, Alas for the weakness of the great! For a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond. And yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eressëa, nay, even as Valinor? And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth as do I. Is it not then our task to labour together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught to the height of that power and knowledge which those who are beyond the sea? So Sauron is doing sort of like a classic lying technique here. He's telling enough of the truth to make the lie believable. He doesn't try to deny that he had been to Lindon and that Gil-galad and Elrond turned him away because they did not trust him. And he sort of says that, well, maybe they did that because they don't love Middle-earth as much as I do, and as much as I'm sure you do, because you stay here when you could easily go to Valinor. And there's a lot of truth mixed in with this. Now, he says that they could make their realms as great as Eressëa or even as Valinor. So Sauron, taught the ringcraft to the elves, and he promised them the power to make Middle-earth as beautiful as the Undying Lands. He name-dropped Eressëa, but then he said, maybe Valinor, though. Maybe Valinor. Celebrimbor absolutely must have thought it was possible, as he created 3 rings without Sauron's assistance. And it was by the power of them that Lindon, Imladris, and most especially Lothlorien were the most akin to the Undying Lands in Middle-earth. Lothlorien even had the timeless quality of Valinor, where time did not seem to pass. It did pass, but the passage of time was difficult to perceive, which is why Samwise was so confused when he came out of Lothlorien, because he saw that the moon was in the same stage that it was when they arrived in Lothlorien, and he was like, does time not pass there, or did we really stay there a whole month? Because it really doesn't feel like we stayed there a whole month. And this was actually a little bit of a holdover from an earlier draft where Tolkien thought that maybe time does not pass in Lothlorien, but then he decided that it did. But then it was like the Undying Lands in the sense that while time passed normally, it didn't feel like time was passing normally. And Aragorn said, no, we really were there for a month, and it is very difficult to perceive the passage of time because of the way that Lothlorien is. And this is where Frodo famously blurts out, oh, it's because of the Lady Galadriel's Ring of Power. And Aragorn's sort of like, you really shouldn't have said that. You really shouldn't have revealed that. So back to Celebrimbor. He's the grandson of Fëanor, and he had some great craftsmanship in his blood because of that. And he loved Galadriel, and he gave her Nenya specifically before bringing the other 2 rings, Vilya and Narya, to Gil-galad. This wasn't even his only attempt in assisting Galadriel in keeping her realm as pure and as like the Undying Lands as he could, because I think he wanted her to stay in Middle-earth. He didn't want her to go back even. Well, she wasn't allowed to, but I don't know if he knew that. He had previously given her the Elisar, which was a green gem that had healing properties. Though in one version of the tale, and once again we have to go to Unfinished Tales for this, in one version of it, it was a copy of the original that Elendil had brought to the Undying Lands, and in another version, it was the original, but it was brought back by Gandalf. I actually prefer the latter. The fact that Tolkien had thought of Celeborn giving Galadriel a second Elisar, though, shows that he was always thinking of her and her realm. So, of course, after the destruction of the One Ring, that sort of magic passed from the world, and Galadriel, as well as Elrond and Gandalf, all passed into the West. Okay, next question. Did Celeborn and Galadriel love each other before coming to Middle-earth? Well, this actually depends on which version of the origin you read. And once again, we're going to have to use Unfinished Tales as a source here. A lot of the answers that I'm giving today have a lot to do with Unfinished Tales, which is why I was very sure that I wanted to read something from it at the beginning of the video. So Galadriel never really found a comfortable spot in the Silmarillion, at least not the way that she should have been in it. She was a character that was created for the Lord of the Rings, and thus Tolkien realized that such an old and important elf had to have a proper backstory and likely a very important role in the Silmarillion. However, Tolkien never settled on Galadriel and Celeborn's origin. He wrote many versions, one of which did wind up in the Silmarillion. We know that she was present in Tirion when Fëanor made his diatribe, mostly repeating things that he had heard from Melkor, and that she walked over the Helcaraxe with the likes of Turgon and Fingolfin. We know that she spent some time in Doriath, and that she passed east over the Misty Mountains before the War of Wrath happened. The Silmarillion is unfinished, and this is important. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote many different stories of how Galadriel and Celeborn met. In one version, Celeborn was a Falmari prince who came over the Helcaraxe with Galadriel, and they were already married at this point. In a variant of this, they came in a ship, and even had the blessing of the Valar, though Christopher's notes state that he feels his father would have intended the blessing to have been rescinded after the destruction of the Two Trees, and that they basically eloped to Middle-earth. In the more accepted version, the one that is most in line with the Silmarillion, Celeborn was born in Middle-earth, and as a Sinda, which is a grey elf, and he was related to Elu-Thingol himself. And Elu-Thingol had been to the Undying Lands, but none of the other Sindar had. At least not the ones that were in Middle-earth. So in that version, he met her in Doriath. So you could read a bunch of J.R.R. Tolkien's different thoughts on Galadriel and Celeborn as a couple in Unfinished Tales, along with his son's notes on them. As Celeborn is not a major character in the Silmarillion, the fact that he's only mentioned in Doriath and called a kinsman of Thingol, I would say that he's a Sinda, and that this Falmari prince idea was just another idea that Tolkien had that either got abandoned or he hadn't decided on an origin, basically leaving it up for Christopher to decide what the origin was going to be after his father's passing. So you could fancifully interpret otherwise and sort of say that maybe the two things work together, but it requires a lot of mental gymnastics, I think. We don't know which version Tolkien intended to be the final canon version, but if we go by the published version of the Silmarillion, Christopher chose the version in which the answer to your question is no, they were not in love yet, they had not yet met because she had not been to Doriath where she met him. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Michael Prose, I hope I'm saying it right, who asks, what would have happened if Morgoth and his forces emerged victorious during the War of Wrath? There was really no victory scenario for Morgoth. In the end, he would lose. Winning the War of Wrath would make things worse for everyone, but he still would lose in the end. The War of Wrath was the Valar's way of saying enough. and putting an end to Morgoth's threat to Middle-earth, but without going over there themselves to take care of it. They had fought him in Middle-earth in the past, and these wars were so destructive that they permanently marred the entirety of Middle-earth, essentially making it a fallen land. The War of Wrath was also quite destructive, as it caused Beleriand to be completely demolished, though with the efforts of Círdan to a shockingly low loss of life when the land cracked and fell into the sea. And though this section is quite brief, as many sections in the Silmarillion are, it is meant to be understood that the sinking of Beleriand was a gradual event that took years to happen. If the likes of Eanwa, an army of Vanyar and Noldor elves, and Earendil, and an army of eagles, the birds of heaven, were defeated, then that is not the end, but the beginning of something far more terrible. Some of the Valar would have to come over to Middle-earth, most likely with Tulkas and Orome leading the charge, and likely a greater number of Maiar in their train. They would defeat Morgoth's army, but the expulsion of such power on the land would have an even more devastating effect. One of the first things that God, who Tolkien calls Ilúvatar, said to Melkor, or Morgoth, was that he was going to lose, that he had no power that does not have its origin in God, and that by doing evil he will only bring about wonders that he cannot even understand, though he will eventually understand them. The marring of the land seems terrible, but it led to a great many wonders, such as the chilling cold that Morgoth brought to the land, giving us snow. All of the Ainur, that's the angels, were present for this speech, including the Valar. But the War of Wrath was not about ensuring that this comes to pass, but in reducing the harm specifically to the children of Ilúvatar. When the first wars happened, the children were not yet awakened. And when the elves awoke and they went after Morgoth a second time, it was not as bad as the first time, but still bad enough that they had to decide to take the elves to the Undying Lands, because it wasn't stained the way that Middle-earth had been. So the Valar were always trying to do the least amount of harm that they could. So as time went by, they hung back more and more. Gradually, Morgoth had spread himself thin. Sauron set out the war. It was truly the end of Morgoth's time. Okay, next question. So here's a question that came in from Taylor Fusher, who asks, Legolas was not in the Hobbit book, so why was Legolas in the Hobbit movie trilogy? Well, that would be the same reason that Galadriel, Saruman, Azog, and Tauriel were in these films. The question may as well be, why was Legolas not in the Hobbit book? To which the answer would be that the character was not yet created by Tolkien. Originally, he wasn't even going to be a major character in The Lord of the Rings, just a messenger sent to tell Elrond that Gollum had escaped. Glorfindel was going to join the Fellowship of the Ring in the early drafts, but Tolkien decided that having Glorfindel in the Fellowship was too great of a power. It would almost be like having a second Gandalf. So Legolas was elevated as a character. He was Thranduil's son, but he's never mentioned in The Hobbit. Thranduil himself wasn't even named in The Hobbit. He was only ever called the Elven King, or just simply the King. However, when you take a tiny book, smaller in page count than any of the individual volumes of The Lord of the Rings, and expand it into 3 hefty films, you kind of need some filler. Now, I'm not saying that it's right to turn The Hobbit into a trilogy. I don't think it was right to do that. But if you are going to do that, you have 2 choices. You either expand it with excruciating detail, like having a lot of time filled up with just characters walking and not saying much of anything for minutes on end, which would not be a very compelling film, or you'll have to add things. Now, in the additions to The Hobbit, out of the ones that I mentioned, Legolas is actually, sort of the least offensive. It actually makes sense that he would be there, although his role shouldn't have been as large as it was. I would have preferred it was just a cameo. Slightly worse is Saruman. He's alluded to in the book. He's just called the White Wizard, but he's never named, and he certainly has no scenes, though the context given in The Lord of the Rings tells us what he was up to. Galadriel is similar. We infer from the sequel, The Lord of the Rings, that she had some role in Gandalf's part in The Hobbit, but as Bilbo didn't know about it, she wasn't in his book. Azog was long dead by the time The Hobbit happened, and Tauriel never existed at all. There's also Radagast. Can't forget him. I suppose we should talk about him briefly. He was mentioned in The Hobbit, but he doesn't have any scenes. But he was left out of The Lord of the Rings. He had a scene in The Lord of the Rings, but that was left out of the film. So I was fine with them including him in The Hobbit, if not exactly fine with the particular way that they portrayed him. Okay, next question. So here's a question that came in from Matthew Culbertson, who asks, if Saruman managed to obtain the One Ring, would Gríma Wormtongue try to steal it from him and use it for himself to rule Rohan? He wouldn't be able to, if we're being honest here. Saruman had a secret room in Orthanc, and this is one of the things where on Quora there was a little bit of, well, how do you know that? You guys watching this video just heard about it when I read that passage earlier in the video. And he kept some things that he really should not have had. One of them was the Elendil mirror, the jeweled circlet that Isildur wore when he died, which glowed so strongly that even when he was wearing the One Ring, that could not dull his glow, the glow of the gems, so he had to cover his head when he wore both the Elendil mirror and the ring. This suggested that Saruman had found and disposed of Isildur's remains, keeping his effects. There was a small pedestal that Aragorn found in this room when he searched it, which he had deduced was a place of honor meant for the One Ring. But Saruman, as I mentioned earlier, he was completely deluded if he honestly thought that he would keep it there. If Saruman obtained the one, he would keep it on him. He would likely wear it and try to master it. Gríma would have no chance at stealing it. Unless, of course, he managed to murder Saruman and take it. In this case, Gríma would have no shot at using the ring anyway. He isn't strong enough. Isildur wasn't strong enough to actually use the ring for its intended purpose. And Gríma is a few degrees of separation away from the likes of Isildur. More than a few, I'm being charitable there. There was also a little bit of drama about this particular question and answer because it was submitted on September the 5th by Matthew Culbertson. And I answered it there exactly as I have read out to you. And then it came up in one of the spaces. Somebody submitted it to a space, not the Grey Havens, not my space, but one of the other spaces that I occasionally contribute to. And then somebody in that space asked me to answer it because they were unaware that I had already answered it. This was just 2 days ago on the 10th. And that's less than 2 days ago. But anyway, I thought what I used to do in this situation where if somebody asks a question that I had already answered, especially if it's a space like that, I would just get the original answer and then link to it. And I would say, thank you for asking me this question. I have already answered it. Here's the link. But I found that when I answer a question on Quora very briefly like that and include a link, it basically gets suppressed in their algorithm. It doesn't get shown to anybody. Nobody sees it. It'll even sometimes be collapsed. So what I did, and what I've started doing, is I just took the answer and I copied it over, and I got a very rude comment earlier today from somebody who said, I know you didn't write this because I read it a week ago and you're plagiarizing it. And I'm just like, well, I guess I'm plagiarizing myself because if you look at the one that you read a week ago, I wrote that. And I showed a screenshot of that original answer that was written on the 5th with my name on it and the one that I wrote later on with my name on it. So you guys... And I'm not speaking specifically to the YouTube audience, but just in general here. But you got to be careful about making accusations like that because I told this guy, I said, I'm going to give you a day to see this comment and to apologize. And then I'm going to report you to the admins of the space because you can't go around making accusations like that without any kind of proof. And that's sort of like... Somebody once asked me, what would Tolkien think of the internet? I said he would be horrified by the internet because it's sort of like, well, the way you would explain it to him, so it's like writing a letter, but it's instant, and he would be horrified that you don't have time to think things out and that everything happens so quickly, and everybody just sort of gives a knee-jerk response. I think Tolkien would have been absolutely, positively horrified by that, and that it leads to people just saying the first thing that comes to their mind without being thoughtful about it at all. Sorry to rant about this, but it did sort of rankle me when somebody says, oh, you've plagiarized this. And I said, I guess I copied myself then. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Wade Smith, who asks, can you show me the fight between Gandalf and the Balrog in the Fellowship of the Ring book, not the movie? So the fight is not in the book. At least it's not in the Fellowship of the Ring. It's in the Two Towers. Just like the fight isn't in the movie, it isn't in the book. This was one of the things that was absolutely correct. Gandalf drops the Balrog into the pit by destroying the bridge. The Balrog snags him by the whip as it falls. The Fellowship leave and escape. The biggest difference in the movie is that Gandalf just kind of hangs onto the ledge a little bit longer, but the scene is very, very accurate. So, like in the movie, we aren't privy to the fight scene because A, we're not supposed to know that Gandalf survives. We're supposed to believe that he died right when he fell in. And B, the story at this point is following Frodo. It's not following Gandalf. So it's in the Two Towers. We do get Gandalf's very brief account of what happened. I'm going to read you an excerpt here. There upon Celebdil was a lonely window in the snow, and before it lay a narrow space, a dizzy eyrie among the myths of the world. The sun shone fiercely there, but all below was wrapped in a cloud. Out he sprang, and even as I came behind, he burst into new flame. There was none to see, or perhaps in after ages songs would still be sung of the Battle of the Peak. Suddenly Gandalf laughed. But what would they say in song? Those that looked up from afar thought that the mountain was crowned with storm. Thunder they heard, and lightning, they said, smote upon Celebdil, and leaped back broken into tongues of fire. Is that not enough? A great smoke rose about us, vapor and steam. Ice fell like rain. I threw down my enemy, and he fell from the high place and broke the mountain side where he smote it in his ruin. Then darkness took me, and I strayed out of thought and time, and I wandered far on roads that I will not tell. So there you have it. Okay, next question. So here's a question that came in from Book Reader. It's interesting. I actually get quite a few questions from this account Book Reader. And I usually don't answer because they're usually the sort of questions that I really don't like very much. But in this case, this is a really good question, though. So if Book Reader is also a YouTube viewer and is watching this, I would say this is the sort of question you should be asking. If Sauron truly repented after the fall of Morgoth, would he have been forgiven? Yes, of course. He was even told exactly how to repent. No one present when Sauron surrendered himself to Eanwa and seeing him renounce his previous evil deeds thought that it wasn't sincere. The issue is that Sauron was looking for the instant gratification of an on-the-spot pardon. Eanwa certainly had the authority to accept his surrender, but not to give him that full pardon on the spot. He wasn't the punishing authority, and therefore he had no right to state that Sauron was forgiven. Eanwa told Sauron that to make his repentance matter, to be forgiven, he would have to travel to Valinor and ask Manwë. Knowing that Melkor had previously been tossed into Mandos for 3 ages, and he was prideful of the high position he had serving Morgoth, Sauron just didn't go through with it. Instead, he attempted to curry favor with the Valar by healing the land, and that didn't work, and he eventually lapsed back into evil. The thing is, even though the Valar had imprisoned Melkor, they did forgive him, which is why, after he was released, they let him walk around and do whatever he wanted. Tulkas would ball his fist up when they saw each other, but for the most part, they treated Melkor as if his repentance had been true, and it wasn't. They also took back Fëanor and all the rest who turned back after the rebellion of the elves, that is. And Fëanor was even made the king of the Noldor, so they had great capacity for forgiveness. And one of my fellows from Quora, Mark Gist, made a very insightful comment that I want to read here for you. When you're immortal, you have to be willing to forgive and forget, at least conditionally, or it's going to be a long, unpleasant eternity. That's absolutely true. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came from Ian Lewis, who asks, why didn't Saruman resurrect like Gandalf? So Tolkien never really set a hard and fast rule on what exactly happens to an incarnate Maya when they die. In the case of Gandalf, he died fighting another incarnate Maya, the Balrog, known as Durin's Bane. Gandalf passed from the world like mortals do. We just read that passage, actually, on paths that he walked along, on paths that he will not tell. But with no indication that he used Mandos as a waypoint, as mortals do. Saruman, on the other hand, rose from his body almost in the way that a discarnate Maya might. For example, Sauron. His body withered, and he looked to the west, but was met with a sharp rebuke in the form of a cold wind which scattered his spirit. His fate is much less like that of Gandalf and much more like Sauron. Sauron normally could create a new body whenever he was killed, but he was never an incarnate. But with the One Ring destroyed, so much of his power was gone, he didn't have the ability to put himself together into a new body or even to do much of anything. So we're never told what happens to Balrogs, for example, when they die. The three that we hear of dying aren't put in a position where somebody could tell us what becomes of the bodies. Do they wither like that or not? For example, Gandalf killed a Balrog, tossed it off the peak, it smote the mountain, but we don't know if it withered or what became of its spirit. Ecthelion's Balrog drowned, and no one reported on what happened to its body or its spirit afterwards because the city was destroyed not long after that. Glorfindel's Balrog was stabbed and then fell into a ravine, taking him with it because it snagged his hair on the way down. And an eagle came and bore Glorfindel's body out for a proper burial, but there was no mention of the Balrog. So comparing the wizards, it's even more interesting that they are voluntary incarnates, while the Balrogs were more akin to Morgoth, incarnated involuntarily. Out of the 5 wizards, 2 died that we know of, and only one of them resurrected. Gandalf is likely just a special case, though, as we learn from his words that he was sent back. His exact words. The figure that is always present, yet never named in the story, the Lord of the Rings at least, is God, who Tolkien refers to as Eru Ilúvatar. And it is only by his grace that Gandalf was not only sent back, but empowered more than he was previously, both in might and in authority. Saruman had no such grace. There was still an intervention of a sort, though. In this case, his body, instantly withering, is likely connected to the cold wind, and the same wind that blew away the form of Sauron before it could reach the captains of the west. Manwe, called the king of Arda, is also the king of the breath of Arda. Wind is his domain, as are the birds of heaven. So it is likely that Manwe not only denied Saruman passage to the west, but also withered his body to prevent him from trying to go back to it, trying to keep himself going via some vile necromancy. This aligns with the description of Manwe's ability to wither the body of elves who need resurrection. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in by the request of Jerry Moore, who asks, I just watched The Desolation of Smaug. Why didn't the movie show the defeat of Smaug? So this confused me at first, but I think in this instance you might be misunderstanding the word desolation. So I'm going to show you here is a reproduction of the map that Thorin has in the book, complete with the moon letters that Elrond managed to decipher. It was also printed in the book. Desolation of Smaug, you can see that there. You can see it written there. And desolation refers to the barren, desolate lands that were blighted by the dragon. Several times it's referenced in the book itself, though the book says Desolation of the Dragon, but the term the Desolation of Smaug is on the map that is printed in the book. So desolation doesn't mean defeat. It refers to the lands surrounding not his defeat. That's in the 3rd movie, the Battle of 5 Armies. Okay, next question. Here's one from the thumbnail, and this came in by the request of... Oh, where does it say it? Hold on. Oh, it's an anonymous one, sorry. What was Galadriel's role in the War of the Last Alliance? I like this question because the answer is really, I don't know. It's unknown. Nothing is said of Galadriel or Lothlorien during the late Second Age and the War of the Last Alliance. The closest would be that after the war, as Isildur led his men to the north in that story that I mentioned earlier, that I read you bits of it, the disaster of the Gladden Fields. At one point, they were protected by a veil, which they deduced was Galadriel expanding her reach to protect Isildur and his men as they passed near their lands. Christopher Tolkien himself noted that Galadriel and Celeborn's involvement and movement during this time was, in his exact words, extremely obscure, meaning that his father did not write anything specific about them. It is possible that Tolkien intended to write about what Galadriel and Celeborn were doing during that time, but as I mentioned earlier, he had a lot of problems with Galadriel and Celeborn and just fitting them into the greater story beyond the Lord of the Rings, and he never got around to it either way. So sorry to tell you that that's one of those that not only do I not know, but we can't really know, because even the author's son says, extremely obscure. Okay, next question. Here's another one that came in from Book Reader, and another one that I would say is a very good question. Why couldn't Saruman see that Sauron was manipulating him? I know nothing about the books, but I've heard that Saruman was the smartest wizard. Saruman left the path of wisdom. Saruman thought that he was the one manipulating Sauron, and that Sauron, for his part, was more than happy to allow him to believe that, as it served his purpose for Saruman to trouble Rohan and perhaps even to unearth the location of the One Ring. Saruman is referred to as the wisest by Gandalf, who might just be the most humble of the wizards. Gandalf was clearly the wisest one, and the only one who kept his head on straight and on mission for the duration. Sometimes words like wisest are thrown around. Celeborn is called the wisest elf, but is he really? Can we name one instance of Celeborn displaying great wisdom? In The Lord of the Rings, he winds up actually looking quite foolish next to his wife Galadriel. Gandalf is very trusting of Saruman until Saruman finally takes the mask off a little and reveals his plans to pretend to join Sauron and subvert his power for good. And Gandalf answers quite plainly. I'm going to read you just a little bit of that section. Saruman, I said, standing away from him, only one hand at a time can wield the one, and you know that well, so do not trouble to say we. But I would not give it, nay, I would not even give news of it to you, now that I learn your mind. You were head of the council, but you have unmasked yourself at last. Well, the choices are, it seems, to submit to Sauron or to yourself. I will take neither. Have you others to offer? And of course, Saruman says yes, but you're not going to like it, and sticks him up on the top of the tower to hopefully cool him off and get him to sort of think on things, because he's sure that Gandalf's going to come around. Of course, Gwaihir the Eagle comes by, and the next time that Saruman goes to check on Gandalf, he's gone. So, but yeah, he told him, you've left the path of wisdom. It was a little bit earlier than that passage I read, and he used a very interesting phrase that I talked about with Sid recently, which was somebody who takes apart a thing to learn how it works has left the path of wisdom. Not takes apart, he said destroyed. So it's an interesting sort of take on natural science versus practical science. But anyway, next question. So here's one that comes in from the Oski Boski, who asks, are there any Ents that had an opportunity to see the Two Trees of Valinor? I don't believe so. And I would say that there's two reasons here. The first is that the Ents seem to be exclusive to Middle-earth and have never actually been in the Undying Lands. I'm unsure whether you would classify them as immortal or mortal but longevous, meaning that they had incredibly long lives. Treebeard, for instance, clearly remembers wandering around Beleriand, which ceased to exist after the First Age. They are spiritual in nature, but they are not Ainur. The second is, based off of the text of the Silmarillion, it seems the Ents may not have existed at the same time as the Two Trees of Valinor. So I'm going to read you a passage from the Silmarillion here. Then Manwë awoke, and he went down to Yavanna upon Ezelohar, and he sat beside her beneath the 2 trees. And Manwë said, O Kenentari, Eru hath spoken, saying, Do then any of the Valar suppose that I did not hear all the song? Even the least sound of the least voice, behold, when the children awake, then the thought of Yavanna will awake also, and it will summon spirits from afar, and they will go among the Kelvar and the Ulvar, and some will dwell therein, and be held in reverence, and their just anger shall be feared, for a time while the firstborn are in power, and while the secondborn are young. But dost thou not remember, Kemantari, that thy thought sang, not always alone? Did not thy thought and mine meet also, so that we took wing together like great birds that soar above the clouds? That also shall come to be by the heat of Iluvatar, and before the children awake, there shall go forth with wings like the wind of the eagles of the lords of the west. It's not entirely crystal clear, but the words of Iluvatar, who is God, referred here as Eru, relayed by Manwë to Yavanna, who is also called Kemantari, indicate that when the children awake, so too will Yavanna's thoughts awaken. The things that she sang of during the Ainulindala, which was the song that created the universe, spirits will be summoned and go into the Kelvar and Ulvar, which is the Elvish way of saying flora and fauna. This is the genesis of many creatures, Ents, of which are one. This seems to indicate that the birth of the Ents would be when the children first awoke. So when the elves first awoke were the firstborn. However, it also says while the firstborn are in their power, and while the secondborn are still young, which might indicate that this awakening may only come after mortal men have awakened in the earth. Mortals awoke with the dawn of the sun, which was created after the destruction of the 2 trees. This may not exactly be a correct interpretation, but I believe I'm about 60% sure on this. And even if not, like I said, there's no record of any of the Ents traveling to the Undying Lands. They seem to be very exclusive to Middle-earth. Okay, next question. Okay, so here's one that came in by the request of KJ's Curiosity, who asks, in The Lord of the Rings, do any dwarves shave their beards at all? No, never. A dwarf shaving his beard would be like a man cutting his arm off, or a hobbit cutting a foot off, or an elf removing their own eye. Actually, it would be worse from a cultural standpoint. A dwarf's beard is an important part of his very identity, and shaving it off would be the same as declaring himself to not be a dwarf. It was also said that a dwarf's beard is usually attractive to the dwarf women, who go for the biggest, bushiest beards that they could find. It was the mark of an experienced warrior and craftsman who was worthy of their affections. And as dwarf women were a protected minority, only 1/3 of dwarves were female, impressing the women was very important. It was the only way the dwarf men would ever be able to get married and start a family. It is mentioned a few times in the Silmarillion that dwarves may tear out chunks of their beards when in moments of extreme anguish and sorrow, but they don't ever shave them off. Okay, next question. Here is a question that came in from, I hope I'm saying this right, Kumali Kokavali. I hope I'm saying it right. I probably butchered it. What is Elendil's lineage in Númenor? Is he part of the royal family? So Elendil is part of the royal family, but he's not in line for the throne of Númenor. Elendil's a royal. He's directly descended from Elros, who was the first Númenorian king. However, the reason that Elendil was not the king of Númenor and could never be the king of Númenor is due to the island's early practice of agnatic ascension, meaning that only the eldest son of a king could become the king. In the absence of any direct male heirs, one would be found from any male relative, such as a cousin or a nephew, descended from Elros strictly through the male line. Interestingly, Númenor's fourth king was named actually Tar Elendil. Those in the line of Elros really like to repeat names from earlier in their line. I would say that any Númenorians and those of Númenorian extraction love to do this. Tar Elendil was the first king whose eldest child was a daughter, Silmarion. So due to Númenor's agnatic practices, she could not become the ruling queen. The queens of Númenor were strictly the wife of the ruling king variety. So Tar Elendil's second eldest became king, Tar Maneldur. However, Silmarion was left with a consolation prize. Her family, the House of Elendil, named after her eldest son, became the Lords of Adunia. They were all directly descended from Elros, and therefore they were royalty, but they were not in line to be the kings, as they were descended through the female line. Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, are descended from Silmarion. So when Elendil, while he was a royal, he was the Lord of Adunia. He was not the king of Númenor. The laws in Númenor actually changed when the sixth king came around, Tar Aldarion. He only had one child, a daughter named Ancalame. I mentioned her earlier. So due to his bitter divorce with his wife, Rendis, no other heirs were produced. So his cousin Soronto was next in line to be the king. However, Aldarion did not wish for Soronto to succeed him, so with the support of the council, he changed the laws so that women could be ruling queens, and his daughter, Tar Ancalame, became the first ruling queen of Númenor. However, this change was not retroactive. That would have created a succession crisis, because then those of the House of Elendil would have had a claim to the throne. Unfortunately, when Elendil set up his kingdom, whether it was his intention or not, Gondor became agnatic, which is why Denethor opposed the ascension of Aragorn II, because he was descended from Anarion through the female line, and Denethor did not consider Isildur to be a king of Gondor. Okay, next question. Here's one that came in by the request of Catby, who asks, why is Fëanor still considered greatest of the Eldar when most, if not all, the elves' woes are directly or indirectly his fault? So I would argue that no one still considered Fëanor the greatest of the Eldar as he stuck in Mandos until the end of the world. Greatest of the Eldar is a descriptor that has been applied to a lot of different characters at different points in time. During The Lord of the Rings, for example, Galadriel is referred to this way, though one could argue that Glorfindel was certainly more powerful than Galadriel. Tolkien is not using greatest to describe mere might, nor is he using it to describe virtue, of which Fëanor would be quite questionable. Fëanor was once the greatest of the Eldar, but he fell, and he fell hard. He did not follow Morgoth, who he hated with a burning passion. As a matter of fact, the name Morgoth was an insulting name that Fëanor himself came up with, but he allowed the Dark Lord to poison his mind, and his pride and his insecurities got in the way, leading him to threatening his half-brother Fingolfin with a sword, getting banished from Tirion, and then Melkor, Morgoth, messed with him further, giving him the idea of going to Middle-earth. Along the way, he slaughtered his kin, and he took a terrible oath. And then upon reaching Middle-earth, he did not last very long. He attempted to challenge Morgoth in battle, but he got slaughtered by the Balrogs. There is one passage that I like to bring up a lot, and it shows exactly how the Valar felt about this. I'm going to read you that passage from the Silmarillion. Thus they held vigil in the night of Valinor, and their thought passed back beyond Ea and forth to the end. Yet neither power nor wisdom assuaged their grief, and the knowing of evil in the hour of its being. And they mourned not more for the death of the trees than for the marring of Fëanor, or the works of Melkor, one of the most evil. For Fëanor was made the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, in valor and endurance, in beauty and understanding, in skill and strength, and in subtlety alike, of all the children of Iluvatar. And a bright flame was in him, the works of wonder for the glory of Arda that he might otherwise have wrought, only Manwë might in some measure conceive. So Melkor essentially ruined Fëanor, who was supposed to be the greatest of not only the Eldar, but of all the children of Iluvatar. The Valar lamented not only his fall, but the loss of all the wonders that he may have created if he had not fallen. I would say that Fëanor at a time was the greatest of the Eldar, but that time is long ago, and he was meant for even greater heights, and he would have been the shining star not only of the elves, but the greatest person to walk the earth, if not from Morgoth. That being said, the actual title of the greatest Eldar to have ever been was probably Luthien. Okay, now we go on to our last question. Are there any Hobbit women described in detail in Tolkien's writings or depicted in Peter Jackson's movies? There are 2 Hobbit women that are featured prominently in The Lord of the Rings. Rose Cotton is the first, usually referred to as Rosie. That's Samwise's girlfriend. She was anxiously awaiting his proposal when he vanished on his journey with Frodo. When he arrived back home, she gave him an earful, but also realized that it must have been important. They got married, and they had a staggering 13 children. Rose was described as being very beautiful, and this passed on to Sam's daughters. Their eldest daughter, Eleanor, was described as being as pretty as an elf, though it was her father, Sam, that said this. He might have been a bit biased. In the film version, Rose is played by the actress Sarah McLeod, and her character is a bit different. Instead of being a farmer's daughter and Sam's girlfriend, she's depicted as a barmaid that he has a crush on. So he strikes up a relationship with her at the very end of the story. The film still portrays the wedding, and it shows the first few children. The baby that she's holding in the picture that I showed you was Frodo Gamgee, who was actually played by Sarah McLeod's real baby daughter. The other prominent Hobbit woman was Lobelia Sackville Baggins, who was a cousin of Bilbo's through marriage. As her husband, Otho, was Bilbo's oldest living relative, she assumed that he would inherit Bag End, which she coveted greatly. However, Bilbo lived much longer than expected, with no sign of aging past 50, which rankled the Sackville Bagginses. Their dreams were crushed when Bilbo named Frodo Baggins as his heir. In the time between Bilbo's birthday party and the announcement that Frodo would be his sole heir, and then Frodo leaving on his journey, Otho died, leaving Lobelia as the head of the Sackville Baggins family. Frodo actually sold Bag End to Lobelia, and she moved in with her son Lotho. While Frodo was on his journey, Saruman took over Bag End and had Lotho murdered, and Lobelia was imprisoned after she attacked one of his men with an umbrella. The news of Lotho's death was a shock to everyone, as they believed that Lotho was the big boss that was running the Shire, but it was really Saruman, using Lotho as his puppet, who he eventually just discarded. Lobelia was very old at this point, and when she was freed from imprisonment, she gave Bag End back to Frodo, who she named as her heir. She passed away a few years later at the age of 102. Lobelia was played by Elizabeth Moody in the Lord of the Rings films, though her scenes were actually cut from the theatrical cut, but you can see her in the extended cut. In The Hobbit, there is the younger version of Lobelia, who's played by Aaron Banks. So anyway, kind of a long episode, I think. I record them in little bits and chunks and then edit it together, but this feels like a bit of a longer one. But I had a lot of fun. Like I said, I really felt like I didn't do enough answering of questions this past week, and then when I looked back on it, I was like, oh no, I have plenty of material for a new video. So thank you guys for coming by and listening to me rant on about the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, and especially Unfinished Tales this week. If you've reached the end of the video and you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. Click the subscribe button, click the bell, turn on notifications, jump through all the hoops that YouTube makes us jump through to get videos in our feed, and consider membership. Like I said, there's been some changes to membership that I think make it more attractive, because it's actually showing the members only videos in the feed for every subscriber, not just the ones who are members. So you can really see, like, oh my God, he's not kidding. He really does upload the videos a week early for members. You'll get to see all the videos early, sometimes even more than a week, although for the weekly episodes, it's usually 7 days. Consider membership. It really helps me out. It's not very costly. It's only $5 a month, you know. For $5 a month, you can sponsor me, so to speak. I will see you guys next week.